Today is May 22nd, 2017, and we're interviewing Father Gilbert.
Thank you.
All right, so my first question is, what led you to the religious life?
Well, it was actually in finding architecture, which is what I teach and which is one of my passions. And I would say it freed me up because once I knew that I found architecture, I began to realize how much that love for a career, let's say, gave me the opportunity to ask the larger question, what else do I want to do with my life? And so I was doing a lot of nonprofit work in architecture in Los Angeles. And again, there was a nice, beautiful passion to it. But then with architecture, I began to realize there's a certain limitation. I'd been active in the church when I was young, but I wouldn't have ever thought of myself as a priest. But that freeing up, it's kind of like when you fall in love, you kind of sense a certain freedom. And for me, that was part of what it was. There was that freedom then to kind of look and explore. And I found at the time, there was a lot of activities going on within the church, a lot of what I would call social justice activity, especially in Central and South America, where the church was standing up for the poor and doing a lot of incredible work, powerful and prophetic work, and I found myself drawn to that. So a combination of maybe timing and the freedom to be able to look for other things.
All right, so then why did you choose the Jesuits?
Well, it's funny. I had never met a Jesuit until I was in graduate school in architecture in Wisconsin. So I grew up in Southern California at a Franciscan parish, knew the Franciscans, and I knew they loved nature. And I hate to say it, but I'm not a big fan of nature. I'm afraid of being in nature. And so I love cities. And the Jesuits were always in urban places. So I would go to Mass at Marquette, even though I was a student at the University of Wisconsin. And I always found the fact that the church always faced a busy street as something profound. Because growing up in the suburbs of Southern California, it always faced a parking lot, and it didn't seem as exciting,
Yeah.
But all of a sudden when the sirens would go by, the homeless would come in, there was always just a mix of people. I just found that really quite fascinating, and that was part of the charism of the Jesuits, was to be in urban centers and to ask the more difficult questions of how do you bring faith in such a desperate situation. I mean, there's the brilliant and the excellent and the successful, and then the struggles of what it all means to live with all these different issues facing you. And especially in Milwaukee, where kind of also a Rust Belt city, the greatness had been an echo of the past, and so that struggle about what does it mean. Now this was before that area around Marquette improved, but it was a pretty dingy area.
Yeah.
So yeah.
All right, so can you tell us a little bit about your formation?
Well, as Jesuits, we start in what is called 2 years in novitiate. So this is a time to learn how to pray. So most of us, in the earlier days, a Jesuit would enter after high school, but nowadays people really enter after college. So they've done some kind of college degree, they may have worked for a while. So the first 2 years is really teaching us how to pray and then how to live in community. And you do a little bit of what are called experiments, where you're working in different locations. So I worked in a retirement center, I worked at a hospital as a chaplain, I worked at a high school doing some retreat work. But for the most part, you spend most of your time learning how to live with other guys for kind of an intentional community experience, and then learning how to pray as a Jesuit, and then some of the history of the Jesuits. Then you go through what are called first studies, which is philosophy. And at that point, I had done one master's level degree, but I didn't have that liberal arts education. So the philosophy studies was a bit more of a struggle for me. After those years, we do what's called Regency. So it's about a 14-year span. The Regency is 3 years of working at one of our Jesuit institutions. So my first 2 years was at Loyola High School in Los Angeles, directing community service, and then here for a year at the University of Detroit Mercy in the School of Architecture. Then 3 more years of theology studies, and then we're ordained. So it's a fairly long process.
Yeah.
And the formation continues after that with what's called final vows. So after working for about 5 years or so, you're called to enter into that final formation, which is another year of tertianship, they call it. And that again might be, for example, I did mine in Australia, so I left for 9 months. And then again, it was part of learning how to kind of relearn how to pray as a community, Jesuit history, and then experimentation, or these experiments working in an area. So I worked with the Aborigines for about 6 to 8 weeks in the Northern Territory of Australia. So that's the formation process. So it's a fairly long one for the Jesuits.
Yeah.
They're not interested in doing a quick turnaround. So.
I can tell. So you already spoke a little bit about your academic background, but can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, I did my undergraduate at the University of California at Irvine, originally in engineering, but I realized I wasn't thrilled by it, and I could not imagine. I was civil engineering, and I thought, I am not going to be designing sewer lines for the rest of my life. This was not where I was feeling called to. So the university was fairly new. It was a 1960s campus with great architecture. So I found myself really drawn to how people were impacted by the built environment, and did a degree in social ecology, and with the specific focus on the environmental psychology of how people are impacted or influenced the built environment. Then from there, took a year off and then went on to do my master's in Wisconsin with a focus on public interest architecture was my specific interest. And then worked for a few years before entering the Jesuits. So I worked for 3 years in Los Angeles area. Then as a Jesuit, again, we do 2 years of philosophy studies, 4 years of theology studies, which is required by the church. And then I went on to do another degree afterwards, which was a focused year of sacred space studies at Yale University through the Institute of Sacred Music, Worship, and the Arts. And it's kind of been jumping back and forth between the architecture school and the divinity school to ask how sacred spaces are formed and what does it mean in contemporary culture. So it's been fun. It's a rich experience, but my sister was always kidding me because I was never a bright student. So she was like, how in the world did you end up in school for this long?
So can you just what happened back then that really shaped what you do or who you are now, especially as a Jesuit?
During the educational time?
Yes.
Okay. Well, again, I would say one of the first ones was, again, this issues in El Salvador. So that was post my master's degree in architecture. So I was working in downtown LA. There's a large grouping of immigrants that had come from Central and South America. That was a kind of a direct route. They would come up into LA to escape the wars that were going on there. I don't know if you're as familiar with what was taking place there, but over 100,000 people disappeared. And they were often catechists and priests and nuns who were being killed at the time. So I would engage in these protests in downtown LA. And that's actually where I met the Jesuits who were in Los Angeles, because they were kind of the leaders of this group. So there'd be over 1,000 people every Wednesday when we'd go and shut down the federal building. I don't know if I should put this on the tape. But it was a way to recognize, again, the power of what the church was doing at the time. So that would be one experience. The LA riots or uprisings, depending on your perspective, took place right when we moved our novitiate from the bucolic hills of Santa Barbara to Culver City, which has now become gentrified, but back then was much more working class. And so the riots came within about 4 blocks of our novitiate, and the city was burning, kind of like what happened here in Detroit 50 years ago. So that experience of seeing the neighborhoods I used to live in on flames was another kind of recognition that there's a need for people to understand justice in a much larger, broader sense, and to kind of tackle those questions that keep fear controlling us. And because fear is never a good way to grow as a society. And again, I think that's one of the insights of Ignatius, was that he was kind of much more free to imagine a world that's fulfilling the notion of the kingdom of God. So those would be the two pivotal ones, I would say.
So my next question is, what led you to your role at the University of Detroit Mercy?
Well, actually, Detroit Mercy is the only Jesuit school with a fully accredited architecture program. So when I was starting, when you enter the Jesuits, you have to go in with the understanding that you're surrendering everything. And that's the famous prayer of Ignatius, that you kind of surrender your will and your understanding, kind of your entire presence. You place it before God, and then where God draws you to is where you're being called to. So I thought I would never go back into architecture, and I was fine with that. I was more than happy. Again, there was a freedom there because I loved architecture, but I knew I could let it go, which kind of seems odd, but there's a freedom. And when I was in the novitiate, actually, they were building some projects, and they would ask me, well, can you give us your input on these buildings we're doing? And so I found myself actually being drawn back into architecture, and they said, well, you're good at this, so why don't you just keep doing this, and we'd be happy to support you in whatever way you wanted to do this. And at the time, there was a Jesuit who was here in our architecture school, Terry Curry, and we were in contact. So when he described the design center, which was started about the time Maureen Fay came as the president, just after the merger, that was the type of work I was doing in Los Angeles with the nonprofit group. So I was just drawn to being in Detroit.
Yeah.
And so I would spend a few summers here every now and then. During the summers as Jesuits in formation, we get to be involved with, again, different experiments, but they're just ways of being engaged in the community. So I spent 2 of my summers here in architecture, and then in China teaching English and doing community organizing in the Bay Area and a bunch of other things. But that interest in architecture kind of came back through that. So after ordination, they said if you'd like to go back to Detroit to be on faculty there, we'd again support it. But it shifted, my interest shifted from just general public interest architecture to sacred space. Partly out of survival. I just realized there's so many ugly churches that I have to be presiding in. And so I said, let me find a way to help. Because most communities, they struggle trying to create beautiful sacred space. And most architects, really good architects, want to do it. So I serve as a bridge between the two, and that's how, so I came here originally to work in the design center, but then I used their community engagement process to help congregations define new sacred spaces.
So have you helped design any churches in this area?
Well, actually, the first one, after 12 years of being here, the first one is a small chapel out at Livonia at St. Mary Mercy Hospital. And again, what I do as a translator, so I help the community define their project, their goals and aspirations, and find an architect who can do it. And then what I do is I help the committee judge the design to see if it's meeting the expectations. And so a really good group of architects, Ply Architecture out of Ann Arbor, was selected for it. And utilizing some of our faculty to help us find that kind of firm that could do that type of work. So that's the closest. A few in Grand Rapids, Connecticut, California, Wisconsin's another project I'm working on right now in Milwaukee. So it's kind of nice to be able to go back there where I had done my training. So it's a great service, actually, that the university provides, because it's all done through the university, through the School of Architecture. So it's not as well known as the Design Center, but it's been doing kind of influential work in sacred space design by bringing in these other architects to really rethink about how we do sacred space.
That's very cool. So how has your ministry changed over the years?
Well, the one shift would be kind of this notion of sacred space, and then being able to develop some classes in that for the architecture school. Most architecture schools are really afraid of the notion of the sacred, but they're intrigued by it. So when I was at Yale, we had we were coordinating a conference on contemporary sacred space, and between the Divinity School and the Architecture School, and the dean of the Architecture School, who's world renowned, would sit there and say, we're not going to talk about the religious use of these buildings. And the Divinity School was like, that's crazy. That's what we're training our ministers to be involved with. But his insight, which was actually very good, was that architects don't understand the religious significance. They tend to be less religious, more spiritual. But in doing so, I think they forget what a congregation or community needs. So it was a very interesting debate that went back and forth. But that was part of my ministry here, was helping Yale with the coordination of this conference and then trying to deal with the struggle. So it was kind of a fun engagement. But as academics, we do that all the time, where we're able to have conversations like this here because we're a Catholic institution. But other schools aren't as free, so sometimes we are able to kind of move out and have those conversations. Like the Design Center does this with public interest architecture, and Dan Patera, for example, travels around the world being able to talk about it because of the wealth of influence that he has here within the city of Detroit. So again, different faculty get to do that, which is kind of fun as faculty, I would say. And now my role is the superior of the Jesuit community, so that's shifted a little bit, which means that my job is to take care of the Jesuits who are here. We have 21 Jesuits that live here. Several of them work at the university, but then others work at the parish, the retreat house. We have one who works at our alternative high school on 5 Mile. So all different Jesuits doing different things, but engaged with this question about what does it mean to be Jesuits in a city like Detroit, which I find fascinating. It's just a great question, and a lot of great minds thinking this through. I think one of the struggles for us is a number of them are aging. So I told my dean, I go, it's like adopting 50 aging parents and telling them they can't drive. It's a difficult thing to do. But the guys here, you ask them what it means to be a Jesuit, and they all know it. So they kind of say, well, I'm disappointed that I'm, like my vision is going. Jerry Albright, for example. But it doesn't crush him at all. He's like, I'll find other things that I'll do and engage in and stuff like that. So there's a wonderful sense of life in all of that, which has been a blessing for me. So it's kind of shifted and changed a bit over time.
I feel like that leads really well into the next question. How does the Jesuit charism influence your work?
Wait, I gotta take a sip. Okay, do you want to ask that one again?
How does the Jesuit charism influence your work?
Well, again, I think for us, our spirituality is kind of based in this searching for the inner voice where God is speaking to us. So it gives us a chance to kind of go back and ask deeper questions, even in difficult situations where we can, kind of discern where the Spirit is leading us. Even like, I'm thinking more in the architectural realm, we'll be working through an issue of a new Jesuit residence like at Fairfield University. And one of the questions was, well, what does poverty mean right now? And most of the community would say, well, it's exactly simple living, which we all agree upon. But then the question becomes, how do we engage the environment? And so by discerning this kind of question, do we spend more money to create a geothermal heating and cooling system for the building because in the long term it provides better payback for the earth, let's say, because we're not using fossil fuels to heat and cool the building. That's a great advantage, but it came with a substantial up in the price. And so then the Jesuits had to kind of negotiate that with people who were saying, well, why are you guys spending so much money on the building? And so it's this kind of asking the deeper fundamental questions about what it means to be living on this planet, as well as being Jesuits who have a vow of poverty, as well as Jesuits who are trying to broaden the expansion of the minds of students that are living there. So not necessarily going back. I mean, this building, for example, is a beautiful heritage building, right? And when I bring my architect students in here, they love it because they don't get to experience this level of an arts and crafts movement, of beautiful tile work, of beautiful carvings of stone and all of this. So it gets their imagination going in unique ways. And Ignatius was real clear about that. For any apostolic work, you do the best that is current at the time. And so for this new building in Fairfield, it was really exploring a contemporary form of design. So it didn't look like anything they've ever seen on their campus before. And at first it scared a number of people, but the Jesuits said, well, this is what it needs to be. And one of the poor Jesuits, who was an older Jesuit, we were getting ready for the move, and the building is wrapped in black corrugated metal. And he goes to me and goes, well, the building's not done yet. And I said, no, Father, it is done. He goes, well, that black corrugated metal, aren't you going to cover it up? And I said, no, that's what the architect showed you when they presented the project. And they said, we thought you were kidding. And I'm like, oh, no. And it won an AIA House of the Year award, so, the Jesuits were kind of like, well, I guess if this is what if this is what the profession is saying is interesting and beautiful, maybe I need to take a step back and just reassess what I consider beautiful. And what it did was students were breaking into the house before it was finished because they were so curious about this design. It wasn't like anything like they've ever seen before. In the way that our students, when they come in here, do the same thing. Yeah. And the Jesuits began to say, well, actually, maybe this does make sense, that maybe we don't have to be locked into what we think is always beautiful, but to allow ourselves to utilize these different expertise. So that's part of the other thing I would say, that for Jesuits, that we're able to let go of our own egos at time and to just kind of say, God gifts people in incredible ways. So how do people bring those gifts into this setting in whatever way it is?
Right. So the next question is, can you tell us about an experience that informed your ideas about social justice?
Well, part of this came from one of these experiments when I was in formation. So I was in for studies in St. Louis University, and again, I was struggling with philosophy because after you've done a master's degree, going back and thinking of philosophy classes is just not that exciting. And so one of the nuns that used to help out at our community, she goes, well, I need some help at a housing project. They were training residents of this huge kind of public housing complex to take over management of their residents. And my job was to train them how to read blueprints because they were going to go through some construction of a new building. And it was an amazing experience working with these women, just trying to teach them how to read the blueprints. But then we realized that in the renovation, money was disappearing and we couldn't figure out what was going on. So another scholastic was an accountant for the state of Illinois, which is not always known for up and up honest government style. So he was used to looking for scandals and corruption. So the two of us are sitting here combing through the books and we can't figure out what is going on. And we go to the women who are organizing, learning how to take over this housing residence, and they kind of said, well, this is enough information. We know that a scam's happening. We'll take it from there. In the middle of the meeting, they dropped hints all through the meeting that they knew exactly where the money was disappearing to. And they got $2 million extra funds by the end of the meeting, just surfaced just by the threats. So afterwards, I kind of asked them, and I said, well, how in the world did you do that? And they go, you don't raise kids in a housing project and not know how to handle a scam. So all we needed to know is there was enough that we could just, sink our teeth into. And I thought, this experience of what it means to navigate a system that is fairly unjust. I mean, the way that they were being treated in this housing project was terrible. But to watch what happens when they were empowered to take over this housing project and to challenge the housing authority and to say this isn't right, and to be able to fight for their the residents in their community. It was just wonderful. And then to see how they began to deal with all the social problems. I mean, they just sat there. They wouldn't take any grief. So, somebody's doing drugs, they were out of there because they said, this is hurting our children. So just being able to engage into their lives a little bit deeper, rather than just from a peripheral, even support kind of system, it kind of taught me to how the strength of what people go through in the midst of struggle. So I always find myself drawn to be in these kinds of communities where there's a bit of a struggle, because they know how to live life and kind of keep teaching me how not to lose heart and to just figure out creative ways of understanding how God's walking with them. So I don't know if that goes directly to your question, but it was an eye opener for me. Before, I would say I was more interested in helping people out rather than learning from them, and I think that's changed in me. It's really learning from them how to succeed, and that's where I think Detroit's brilliant, because these communities are filled with people, everyday people who know how to navigate through struggles. So, yeah.
All right. So the last question is, what do you think the future of the order and the church will be?
Ooh. Well, it's always evolving. From when Ignatius started this, it built up really fast because people were intrigued. The church at that time was not the most, how would I say, it was filled enough with scandal and stuff, so people were not really trusting the church anymore. So Ignatius, because of the way that he challenged the church at that time, I think was able to help grow it. It was also the time of the exploration of the New World, so people were really interested in going and experiencing new things. And the Jesuits gave a framework for people to understand that. So now, as we kind of go into this kind of generation that isn't as well coached in traditional Catholic culture, as they begin to emerge, trying to just figure out new ways to engage that. So I think the order shrinks a bit, but those ebbs and flows are common throughout history. But I think because we try to stay relevant to the community, and partly I think being able to have all these high schools and colleges and universities around helps us see the future in ways that we're not fearful. I mean, when you teach kids, you begin to realize, again, there's a tremendous amount of wisdom that's generating there, so you don't lose heart. So I would say it'll change. How it'll change, I'm not really quite sure, but I would say it'll survive and thrive just because of the ability to be around young people who are just incredible in how they see the world. So I don't know if that.
No,
I don't know if
thank
that
you
answers
so much.
Sure.
That's great. That was my last question.
Oh,
Thank you
okay.
so much for doing this.
Thanks.